In April 1857, a traveling cotton broker from Charleston named William Thorne stumbled upon something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. While examining plantation ledgers at a modest Georgia estate known as Moss Creek, he noticed a disturbing irregularity. Over a span of 15 years, the records showed 23 male slaves sold, each commanding far above the market price, and each entry marked with the strange notation "prime condition certified." What appeared at first to be a sign of shrewd management concealed something much darker. Those two words would later be recognized as the key to one of the most horrifying secrets of the antebellum South, a secret so corrosive it would shake the foundations of Georgia's most respected families and reveal the moral rot at the heart of their prosperity. Moss Creek was an unremarkable estate by the standards of Southern aristocracy. It covered about 370 acres of red Georgia clay between the Oconee River and the rural road connecting Milledgeville to Augusta. There were no white, columned verandas or perfumed gardens, no opulent parties drawing the county's elite. The house was a plain two-story structure of local timber, functional, not grand, surrounded by a cotton gin, a smokehouse, a large barn, and a cluster of 12 slave cabins. The plantation's reputation rested not on elegance, but on efficiency. Its owner, Eleanor Cresswell, had taken control after the sudden death of her husband Thomas in 1840, when she was only 31. Her neighbors expected the young widow to sell and return to Savannah, where her family ran a shipping business. Instead, she dismissed the overseer, assumed full control, and within a year transformed the struggling property into one of the most profitable mid-size plantations in the county. Eleanor's methods were as unconventional as they were effective. While most planters built multi-generational slave communities, she treated her enslaved workforce as short-term investments. She would purchase young, strong men, always between 18 and 25, from regional markets, keep them for a year or so, then sell them westward to planters in Alabama, Mississippi, or Louisiana, where cotton expansion demanded constant labor. The women on the plantation were few, 6 or 7 older women who managed domestic work and were deliberately chosen for their inability to bear children. Eleanor had no interest in families, nurseries, or the continuity that characterized other estates. Profit and control were her only priorities, though her neighbors saw something else behind her composure. An unnerving detachment, an intelligence too cold for comfort, a determination that hinted at hidden motives. By 1845, Eleanor Cresswell had acquired a local reputation as a woman both formidable and mysterious. Male planters who had at first refused to negotiate with her came to respect her grasp of soil management, cotton yields, and market trends. She never attended church, never hosted socials, and declined the charitable work expected of Southern ladies. When asked about her isolation, she would reply with a thin, humorless smile, "Widowhood frees one from the burden of pretense." What no one realized was that beneath this calm exterior, she maintained 3 sets of ledgers. The first contained ordinary plantation accounts for public inspection. The second recorded the true profits, far exceeding what she declared. The third, written in a private cipher derived from her father's maritime codes, was hidden in an iron box beneath her bedroom floorboards. In that secret book, Eleanor documented everything: names, dates, physical traits, and cryptic observations that hinted at purposes far beyond commerce. Every man purchased at Moss Creek was catalogued in chilling detail. She noted eye color, hair texture, the angle of a jaw, the shade of skin under lamplight. To an outsider, these might seem the idle fixations of a meticulous owner, but to Eleanor they were data for something larger, a genealogical archive meant to expose the hidden bloodlines of Georgia's elite. Night after night, she filled those coded pages with information that, if ever revealed, would annihilate reputations. Her plantation was not merely an enterprise of cotton and profit, it was a laboratory of vengeance. The other slaves knew something terrible occurred behind the locked doors of the main house. When a new young man arrived, he was kept apart from the rest for a week. On the seventh night, Elinor would summon him. Servants observed ritualistic preparations, the bath, the plain gray dress, the lamp burning late into the night. By morning the young man would emerge changed, eyes downcast, movements hesitant, as if some part of him had been broken. The following day, Elinor secluded herself in her study beside the open iron box, writing for hours with an intensity that frightened even the bravest house servant. Soon after each ritual came a sale. A doctor would certify the man's excellent condition, and Elinor would arrange transport to a distant buyer. Yet, one by one, these men vanished between Moss Creek and their destinations. The first, Samuel, was said to have escaped on the road to Alabama. Then came Isaac, lost on the way to Mississippi. Elinor's paperwork was impeccable, receipts, signatures, shipping records, so buyers grudgingly accepted their losses. Over the next few years, 5 more disappeared, each case dismissed as another runaway seeking freedom. But none had escaped. Their bodies lay buried on a stony patch of Moss Creek land where Elinor forbade plowing, claiming she would someday plant an orchard there. The orchard never came. Beneath that soil, graves accumulated quietly. Her killings were systematic. Each began with the same ritual, each ended in the same locked barn where she offered her victims whiskey laced with laudanum. Drowsy but aware, the men were shown her ledger as she coolly explained their selection. Their features mirrored those of Georgia's most prominent white families. Through them she could prove that the men who thundered about racial purity had fathered children they would never acknowledge. When the drug took hold, Elinor summoned her accomplice, the only person who knew the full extent of her scheme, her secret son, Henry Cresswell. Official records listed her as childless, but in truth she had borne a son in 129, 7 years before her marriage. The father had been an enslaved dockworker in Savannah, sold away when her pregnancy was discovered. Elinor's family buried the scandal. The baby was sent north to Philadelphia to be raised by her aunt under another name. The loss hardened her. When she learned years later that her lover had died of exhaustion in the Louisiana sugar fields, grief curdled into a cold, purposeful hatred. She resolved to destroy the system that had destroyed her, and the plan she devised would span decades. After her husband's death, she summoned Henry back to Georgia under the alias Henry Lell, a respectable equipment merchant from Philadelphia. Publicly, he was merely a business contact who visited Moss Creek occasionally. Privately, he was her partner in an enterprise of murder and documentation. Beneath the barn, they built a secret cellar accessible through a concealed trap door. There they performed their work, measurement, record, keeping, burial. Together they turned vengeance into science. Each victim was chosen deliberately. Elinor studied auction markets not for muscle, but for lineage. She sought faces that betrayed hidden ancestry: gray, green eyes like Senator Caldwell's, the distinctive nose of the Rutledge clan, the jawline of the Paytons. She cross-referenced gossip, family genealogies, and servants' whispers to trace which powerful men had fathered mixed-race children. When she found one, she bought him, recorded every physical detail, then ensured he could never vanish from her archive. Living witnesses might flee, bones could not. By 1850, 13 men lay buried beneath the future orchard, each catalogued as proof of white hypocrisy. Elinor told herself their deaths would someday ignite justice. But as the decade advanced and the nation drifted towards civil war, even she began to sense that her grand design might be overtaken by history itself. Under the oppressive heat of a Georgia summer in 1856, a letter arrived at Moss Creek that would alter the quiet rhythm of Elinor Cresswell's long, methodical campaign. The letter bore a Boston postmark and the name Daniel Harrington, a lawyer and correspondent for the abolitionist newspaper, The Liberator. His tone was formal but pointed, expressing his intention to visit her plantation to investigate certain irregularities in her business records. He mentioned rumors of an unusually high turnover of male slaves, and several unexplained disappearances. Eleanor read the letter 3 times, her expression unreadable, and then summoned Henry from Milledgeville. When he arrived that evening, she showed him the letter in silence. After reading it, he looked up with the calm concern of a man accustomed to danger. "Do we stop?" he asked quietly. "Go quiet until he loses interest." Eleanor's lips tightened into that familiar smile devoid of warmth. "No," she said. "We invite him to visit. We'll show him exactly what he expects to see, a successful widow managing her plantation with competence, and then we'll learn who sent him and what he truly knows." Her words carried an assurance that bordered on arrogance, but Henry heard the tremor beneath them. For 16 years their secret had held firm, but now it had drawn attention from the north, and that meant exposure was closer than ever. When Harrington arrived at Moss Creek that September, his first impression was of precision and order. He was a thin man with sharp features, his northern mannerisms marking him immediately as an outsider in the Georgia countryside. Eleanor greeted him with practiced civility, offering cool water and the rehearsed warmth of a southern hostess. He began with polite introductions, then wasted little time before stating his purpose. He spoke of reports suggesting that Moss Creek employed an unusual all-male workforce, and that several of those men had disappeared during transport to other plantations. Eleanor's reply was calm, her voice smooth as glass. She explained that she purchased young men, trained them, improved their health, and sold them at profit like any prudent businesswoman. If some had escaped, that was regrettable but hardly criminal. Her paperwork, she reminded him, was flawless. Harrington listened carefully, taking notes in a small leather-bound book. When he asked to speak with her workers or nearby planters, she agreed, though she warned him that his questions would not be well received. "Georgia is not Boston, Mr. Harrington," she said evenly. "People here protect their own." It was not a threat, yet its meaning was unmistakable. Harrington left that first meeting unsettled. Her composure was too perfect, her answers too measured. He spent the next days questioning merchants, doctors, and neighboring planters. All spoke well of Eleanor Cresswell. She was efficient, honest, and solitary, a woman who kept to herself and whose business dealings were beyond reproach. By the 4th evening, Harrington was ready to leave, convinced he had chased a phantom, when an elderly black woman appeared at his boarding house door after dark. She introduced herself as Ruth, a servant from Moss Creek, and begged for a moment of his time. In hushed tones, she described strange happenings at the plantation. The 7-night rituals, the locked barn room, the men who vanished without farewell. Her voice trembled as she spoke, twisting her worn hands together. "She ain't right, that lady," Ruth said. "Been wrong since Mr. Thomas died. She buys them young men, but not all get sold like she says. Some just disappear, and there's a part of the land she won't let nobody work. Says she'll plant an orchard there someday, but she's been saying that for years." When Harrington pressed her for details, Ruth hesitated, then mentioned another figure, the equipment merchant who often visited, a man called Mr. Lell. "He stays for days sometimes," she whispered. "They sit late at night over her books, talking low. Ain't no new tools ever come with him neither." Realizing she had said too much, Ruth fled into the night, leaving Harrington alone with the weight of her testimony. The next morning he returned unannounced to Moss Creek. Eleanor was in the yard directing laborers, her demeanor as composed as ever. When Harrington requested a full tour of the property, she consented without argument, though her eyes hardened slightly. He followed her through the slave quarters, the smokehouse, the cotton gin, everything clean and ordinary, nothing amiss. When they reached the barn, he asked about the locked door at the back. Eleanor hesitated for a heartbeat, then produced a key. Inside was a dusty room filled with broken plows, old tools, and cobwebs. It looked convincingly abandoned. Harrington searched, finding nothing but rust and decay. Eleanor stood in the doorway, her expression faintly amused. "Satisfied, Mr. Harrington?" she asked. He could only nod, though his instincts screamed otherwise. As they walked back, his eyes drifted toward the far edge of the property, the patch of rocky ground Elinor had once described as future orchard land. The earth there looked uneven, as though turned and packed down again. He asked casually why it remained untouched. Poor soil, she answered smoothly, too rocky for cotton. He thanked her and rode back to Milledgeville, uncertain whether he had uncovered a mystery or merely imagined one. What he could not know was that beneath the very floor he had walked upon lay the truth Ruth had feared to speak aloud. The room he inspected was a decoy, prepared weeks earlier. Beneath it, through a concealed trapdoor buried under barrels and straw, a hidden cellar stretched into darkness. There, in wooden boxes labeled in code, rested the remains of 13 men, each one catalogued as evidence in Elinor's crusade. Harrington stayed in Georgia for another week, questioning everyone who might shed light on Moss Creek. He found no missing records, no witnesses, no physical proof of wrongdoing. Ruth's word alone could not stand in court, and without tangible evidence, his northern editors refused to risk printing accusations that could be dismissed as abolitionist propaganda. His article appeared in the Liberator as a short column on page 7. An anonymous plantation in Georgia rumored to conceal horrors, the allegations unverified. Within weeks, the story was forgotten. Elinor, however, never forgot. The lawyer's visit had exposed cracks in her carefully built facade. Someone, Ruth, had betrayed her. For the first time in years, she realized her secret was not invulnerable. Fear gave way to resolve. She called Ruth to the parlor one night and spoke gently, almost kindly, telling her she understood the fear that drove her to speak. Then she explained her purpose, revealing the coded ledgers and sketches. Each man she had killed, she said, carried the blood of powerful white families. Their deaths, to Elinor, were not murder but preservation of evidence, the only proof that could survive in a society deaf to justice. Ruth listened in horror as Elinor spoke of genetic ties between slaves and senators, fathers and sons divided by color but joined by blood. Living men can lie, Elinor said softly, dead men cannot. Ruth called it evil, Elinor called it necessary. When she asked about the mysterious Mr. Lell, Elinor smiled with rare tenderness. He's my son, she said, the child of a man my father once owned. That's why I'll never stop. Ruth left that night broken, burdened with knowledge that felt like a curse. Over the next months, Elinor's work grew frantic. Between October 1856 and March 1857, she purchased 3 more young men, each chosen with greater care. Henry spent long nights in the cellar, making copies of her ledgers, translating the code, hiding duplicates in vaults and law offices from Savannah to Philadelphia. They believed they were racing against time, unaware that the discovery of their crime was already written into fate. By spring, Elinor's collection connected 17 families, her web of proof nearly complete. One more year, she thought, and her reckoning would begin. But in April 1857, William Thorne, the cotton broker from Charleston, arrived to inspect her accounts, and with his sharp eye and meticulous nature, he saw what others had missed. Within the neat columns of figures and tidy margins of her books, he found the pattern that would begin her undoing. William Thorne was not a man easily swayed by charm or appearances. His reputation as a cotton broker rested on precision, and when he visited Moss Creek in April of 1857, it was not idle curiosity that drove him but habit, the relentless instinct to verify every detail. He reviewed Elinor Cresswell's ledgers with the same scrutiny he gave any plantation's books, yet something in her records immediately caught his attention. The profits were too consistent, too perfect. Every male slave sold fetched a price well above market value, each transaction accompanied by the same phrase written neatly in the margins: prime condition certified. Most planters' records fluctuated, reflecting market shifts, illness, or bad harvests, but Elinor's numbers formed a pattern that seemed impossible without manipulation. More troubling still, several names appeared in her sales list, but never surfaced again in the buyer's own logs, which Thorne had access to through his extensive network of Southern clients. It was as if these men had vanished from the world after leaving Moss Creek. He mentioned the discrepancy lightly at first, expecting an explanation about training, diet, or breeding practices. Instead, he caught a fleeting expression on Eleanor's face, something like panic quickly suppressed beneath her usual calm. It was gone in an instant, but for a man like Thorne, accustomed to reading the small betrayals of nervous planters and dishonest merchants, that flicker was enough. He left Moss Creek with polite words and a firm handshake, but suspicion had rooted itself in his mind. He intended to make quiet inquiries to confirm whether the slaves Eleanor claimed to have sold ever truly arrived at their destinations. That evening, as Thorne's carriage rolled away into the dusk, Eleanor stood on the veranda watching the dust settle behind it. The moment he was out of sight, she turned sharply and called for a messenger. Within hours, a rider was on the road to Milledgeville, carrying a brief, coded note to Henry. When he arrived that night, Eleanor was pacing her study, her calm replaced by a brittle tension. "He noticed," she said as soon as he entered. "He's going to check with the buyers. Once he does, the pattern will expose everything. If he reports it, it's over, all of it." Henry listened, hands clasped behind his back, the flickering lamplight sharpening the lines of his face. "Then we stop," he said finally. 17 families are enough to ruin the rest. We release what we have now, mail the copies, let the truth burn them." Eleanor shook her head with sudden fury. "No, 17 won't be enough. They'll deny it, dismiss the documents as lies. We need more, Henry. We need enough evidence to make denial impossible." Her voice trembled with conviction and madness intertwined. Henry watched her, seeing the woman who had once been his mother dissolve into something colder, harder, consumed entirely by her purpose. They stood in silence for a long time until Eleanor spoke again, her voice low and deliberate. "We eliminate the problem." Henry turned toward her slowly, not sure he had heard her right. "Eliminate? Thorne," she said. "He's alone, far from Charleston. He'll verify the records first, not accuse immediately. That gives us time, a few days at most. We use them." Henry's expression darkened. "You're talking about killing a white man," he said. "A broker, a respected one. This isn't the same as before, the slaves. No one asks questions when they disappear, but Thorne, they'll hunt for whoever did it." Eleanor's reply was calm, terrifying in its clarity. "Then we'll give them someone to hunt, a runaway slave, a robbery gone wrong. They'll believe what they're accustomed to believing." Over the next 2 days, mother and son planned every detail. Thorne was staying at the Milledgeville Hotel and, according to inquiries made through Henry's contacts, took a solitary walk each evening after supper along the quiet road that curved toward the river. He carried a small pistol but little else, confident that a gentleman in Georgia had nothing to fear from the people who depended on him. On the evening of April 23rd, the sun dipped low behind the trees as Thorne set out on his habitual walk. The air was thick with the scent of pine and dust. From behind the brush a man emerged, wearing the coarse clothes of a field hand and a hat pulled low. Witnesses later said the attacker moved with desperate speed. There was a brief struggle, a single gunshot that missed, and then the dull sound of wood striking bone again and again until the silence returned. Thorne lay crumpled beside the road, his skull shattered, his pistol a few feet away. His watch and purse were gone, but his leather satchel of documents remained untouched. When locals found the body hours later, they assumed robbery. The county erupted in outrage. Patrols scoured the countryside for the unknown runaway, who had killed a white man in cold blood. Plantations were searched, slave quarters raided, but no culprit was ever found. The investigation ended, as so many did in those years, with fear, violence, and no answers. While the search parties combed the fields, Henry sat in the parlor at Moss Creek, dressed neatly in the clothes of a traveling merchant, sipping tea with a visiting neighbor who had come to offer condolences for the tragedy that had shaken the region. No one suspected the quiet, well-spoken Mr. Lel of anything more sinister than business. The disguise had been perfect, the timing flawless. Elinor had burned Thorne's name from her ledgers that same night, erasing all trace of his visit. His death, she told herself, had been necessary, an act of defense for the greater good. Yet something shifted inside her after the killing. For the first time, she could not entirely silence the voice that whispered that Thorne had done nothing to deserve his fate. He had not been cruel or complicit, he had simply noticed what others ignored. Henry felt the change too. He spoke less, stayed away longer. When he returned, he avoided the cellar. The purpose that had once united them began to feel like a weight dragging him into darkness. In his mother's presence he concealed his doubts, but alone he wondered whether the line they had crossed could ever be retraced. Thorne's murder had bought them time, but also condemned them to a new kind of fear, the fear of being hunted not by justice but by conscience. Elinor continued her work with cold efficiency, but even she sensed the difference. Her vengeance had required the blood of slaves. Now it demanded the blood of her own kind. The transformation was complete. She was no longer simply fighting a system. She had become one, consuming lives to sustain itself. Outside Moss Creek, life went on as though nothing had changed. The fields ripened with cotton, the river glistened under the sun, and neighbors still tipped their hats to the courteous widow who managed her estate with such admirable discipline. But beneath the barn, under layers of straw and secrecy, the cellar grew heavier with its burden of the dead. In the darkness of that place, the ideals that had once fueled Elinor's mission, justice, exposure, truth, had curdled into something monstrous. The ledger she had begun in grief had become a gospel of ruin, each entry another testament to how vengeance, once set loose, can consume everything it touches. And though the world above remained silent, Moss Creek itself seemed to know. The air around it thickened, the nights grew stiller, and those who passed along the road after sunset swore they could hear faint echoes rising from the earth, whispers of men who had vanished, carried by the wind through the fields that had once been watered with their blood. After William Thorne's murder, the silence around Moss Creek grew heavier, as though the land itself had begun holding its breath. The investigation raged across the county, patrols scouring swamps and barns in search of a runaway who didn't exist. The newspapers printed fearful columns about slave uprisings and northern agitators, and yet within a few weeks, the noise faded into the familiar quiet of resignation that followed every unsolved killing in the South. No one thought to question Elinor Cresswell, the dignified widow who conducted herself with unshakable composure. She wrote polite letters of condolence to Thorne's associates and continued running her plantation with apparent normalcy. Her accounts balanced, her cotton shipped, her profits steady. But behind that calm mask, she felt something begin to erode. For 16 years, she had convinced herself that each death she caused served a purpose, that every man buried beneath her rocky field was a necessary offering to the greater truth she sought to expose. Thorne's death, however, was different. He had not been part of the corrupt order she despised. He had merely stumbled across it. His blood was not the blood of hypocrisy she wanted to spill, it was the blood of innocence. Yet even as that realization gnawed at her, Elinor could not stop. The machinery she had built in secret was now too large, too dangerous to abandon. Her son Henry felt it too. In the days following the murder, he grew quieter, spending long hours outside, avoiding the cellar, and offering fewer words in their late-night discussions. Where his mother saw destiny, Henry saw decay. He had always believed in her cause, had justified their violence as an act of rebellion against a monstrous system, but Thorne's lifeless face haunted him. The idea that their righteous mission had crossed into senseless murder left him hollow. Still, he stayed, perhaps out of loyalty, perhaps out of fear, or perhaps because, like Elinor, he knew that turning back was no longer possible. The months that followed passed uneasily. The routine at Moss Creek continued, But something intangible had changed. The slaves noticed it first. The way Elinor moved through the house like a shadow, how her once measured tone now carried an edge of exhaustion. She spoke less to them, and when she did, her words came distant and detached, as if her mind was elsewhere. At night, lamps burned later than before, the light from her study spilling across the yard long after midnight. Sometimes they heard the faint scrape of metal, the turning of pages, the low murmur of her voice reading aloud from her coded ledgers, as though seeking reassurance from her own madness. Henry's visits became shorter, though when he came, he and Elinor still spent hours together behind closed doors. Unknown to anyone, he had begun preparing for what he called the end game. He made multiple copies of her ciphered books, translating them into plain English and sending them to secret locations: a bank vault in Savannah, a lawyer's office in Charleston, a contact in Philadelphia. Each copy was another thread in the web of evidence they planned to release once the moment arrived. They imagined a storm of exposure that would tear apart Georgia's ruling class, revealing the hidden bloodlines connecting its proudest names to the very people they enslaved. But while Elinor obsessed over completion, Henry saw what she refused to admit: that their reckoning, if it ever came, would not bring justice but only ruin. As 1857 drew to a close, the weight of what they had done pressed more heavily upon them both. The cellar beneath the barn, once a place of purpose, now seemed to throb with guilt. The stench of the soil above it clung to the air no matter how often Elinor ordered it scrubbed clean. She had achieved near perfection in her secrecy, yet paranoia had begun to whisper in her ear. Every visitor, every stray question, every letter felt like a potential threat. She started burning correspondence after reading it, speaking less to her neighbors, and refusing to allow anyone, including the doctor who once examined her slaves, to enter her property uninvited. Rumors spread quietly through the county that the widow Cresswell had grown eccentric, perhaps touched by grief or loneliness, though no one dared confront her. Those who passed by Moss Creek after dark swore the windows of the main house glowed at strange hours, and that sometimes a single candle could be seen burning in the upper room until dawn. Then came the war everyone had been whispering about for years. By 1861, the South was tearing itself apart. The world that had given Elinor power, the plantations, the wealth, the rigid hierarchies, began to crumble under the weight of its own contradictions. Armies marched, cities burned, and the men who had once bragged of chivalry and honor were now dying in muddy fields. For Elinor, it was both vindication and disaster. She had long dreamed of a moment when the South's corruption would be exposed, but the chaos of war left no space for revelation or justice. Her meticulously documented truth was lost in the roar of cannons and the collapse of a way of life. In 1863, the woman who had built Moss Creek into a tomb for others became its final prisoner. Ill with pneumonia, she died quietly in her bed at 54, her coated iron box still hidden beneath the floorboards. Henry vanished the following year, swallowed by the chaos of the war. Some said he fled north again, others that he was killed during one of the countless skirmishes that devoured men without names or graves. The copies of their ledgers were destroyed or lost. The bank in Savannah burned, the lawyer in Charleston died, the northern contacts disappeared. Moss Creek itself, stripped of labor and leadership, fell into decay. The one-sorted fields turned to wilderness, and the barn, swollen with the weight of history, collapsed in a storm in 1871. For nearly 4 decades, the land lay silent, its terrible secret sealed beneath layers of earth and time. The graves Elinor had filled in pursuit of truth became indistinguishable from the soil she had once called her own, until the day when progress came to reclaim the forgotten ground and force the past to speak again. In the spring of 1902, long after the echoes of war had faded and the memory of Moss Creek had slipped quietly into local folklore, the land was sold to a developer, planning to build a school. The old plantation house had long since rotted into ruin, its timbers collapsing inward like a body exhaling its final breath, and the barn, once the secret heart of Eleanor Cresswell's work, was nothing but a broken skeleton of beams swallowed by vines. The men who arrived to clear the site thought they were digging on ordinary ground, but within days their shovels struck what felt like stone. When the first skeleton surfaced, pale bone gleaming in the sunlight, the workers froze. Then another appeared, and another, until the earth itself seemed to yield a procession of the dead. By the end of the week, 16 bodies had been unearthed from the rocky patch Eleanor had always claimed was too poor for cotton. Each skeleton was buried shallowly, some wrapped in remnants of fabric, and beside several were small wooden boxes containing hair, sketches, and fragments of handwritten note, evidence of an obsession that time had almost erased. The discovery sent shock through the county. Newspapers from Savannah to Atlanta printed sensational headlines about the graves of Moss Creek, speculating wildly about who the victims might be and why they had been buried there. Some whispered that it had been a cholera pit. Others claimed it was an old slave cemetery, while a few local elders muttered stories their parents had passed down about a strange widow who had lived alone and kept secrets that no one dared question. When investigators reached what remained of main house, they found the floorboards soft with rot. Beneath them, hidden inside a rusted iron box, lay the final piece of the puzzle. A stack of ledgers, sketches, and coded writings, all preserved surprisingly well despite decades of damp. The sheriff handed the box over to county officials, who in turn sent it to the courthouse for safekeeping. Its contents were examined briefly, dismissed as indecipherable, and shelved in the archives, where dust and neglect did their quiet work. Without anyone to translate Eleanor's cipher, the ledgers became little more than curiosities, relics of an eccentric mind lost to history. For 50 years they sat forgotten, while Moss Creek's terrible story returned to silence once more. It was not until 1957, exactly a century after William Thorne's murder, that a young graduate student from the University of Georgia stumbled upon the iron box while researching antebellum economics for his dissertation. Fascinated by its contents, he began the painstaking work of decoding the strange system of symbols and maritime shorthand. It took him 2 years to unravel the cipher, and when he finally understood what he was reading, disbelief nearly stopped him cold. The ledgers were not accounts of trade or property. They were records of people, each entry cataloging physical details, family connections, and coded notations linking enslaved men to prominent white families. There were sketches showing profiles, measurements of bone and skin, and remarks identifying resemblances to well-known Georgian surnames: Caldwell, Peyton, Rutledge, and others. Eleanor's handwriting was steady throughout, the same calm precision she had once used to sign business documents now employed to record the results of murder. Even more disturbing were the phrases that appeared beside certain names: preserved for evidence, final measure complete, blood confirmed. These were the euphemisms of a killer who believed herself a historian. When the student presented his findings to his professors, they refused to believe him at first. The notion that a 19th-century plantation mistress had orchestrated such a calculated campaign of violence defied every accepted narrative of the Old South. But the evidence was undeniable. Dates matched sales records, the handwriting matched Eleanor's known correspondence, and the physical remains uncovered at Moss Creek corresponded precisely to the descriptions in her book. Reluctantly, the university committee allowed him to publish his dissertation in 1959. It caused a minor storm among historians, but was largely ignored by the public. The families Eleanor had sought to expose were either extinct or stripped of influence by time. The society she had tried to destroy had already been undone by war and history itself. Her revelations came a century too late to wound the people they were meant to condemn. Still, her notes accomplished what she had always intended. They proved beyond argument that the boundaries of race upon which the antebellum South had built its moral edifice were lies. The very men who had preached purity and hierarchy, had fathered children with the women they enslaved, and the proof of that hypocrisy had been buried literally and figuratively in the soil of Georgia. Yet the triumph was hollow. By the time the world read Eleanor's work, it no longer mattered. The crimes had no living perpetrators, no surviving witnesses, no courts willing or able to assign guilt. Her evidence, perfect though it was, stood as a monument to futility, documentation of truth that had lost its power to punish. The academic debate that followed her rediscovery divided scholars for decades. Some argued that Eleanor Cresswell had been a visionary, woman ahead of her time who used the only tools available to challenge an institution that thrived on cruelty. Others condemned her as a monster no better than the men she sought to expose. They pointed to the cold precision of her murders, the way she had turned human beings into specimens, her perverse belief that killing could serve justice. Even among those who studied her, there was discomfort, a sense that she had forced history to confront a question it preferred to avoid. Can truth born of atrocity ever be considered righteous? The slaves who had survived Moss Creek offered no easy answers. A few who lived long enough to be interviewed remembered her as distant but fair, a woman who demanded obedience but rarely raised her voice. Others recalled an atmosphere of constant dread, of nights filled with sounds they pretended not to hear, and mornings marked by the absence of someone who had been there the day before. Ruth, the woman who had once warned Daniel Harrington, lived into the late 1880s. In her final years, she spoke rarely of Moss Creek, though once, to a preacher's wife, she said, "That house was evil from the roots up," but she thought she was doing God's work. By the time the 20th century turned, the name Eleanor Cresswell had become a footnote in specialized histories of the South, her story reduced to academic curiosity. Moss Creek itself vanished under progress. A shopping center replaced the old plantation, and the rocky field where she had buried her victims was paved over to make a parking lot. A small marker was eventually placed nearby, noting simply that the land had once been a plantation operated by Eleanor Cresswell, with no mention of what lay beneath. Tourists and locals pass it every day, unaware that beneath the asphalt lie the remains of men whose lives ended as part of a crusade for a justice that never arrived. The iron box and its contents now rest in the Georgia Historical Society archives, its ledgers digitized and cataloged, accessible to anyone curious enough to look. Yet almost no one does. Eleanor Cresswell's truth, the one she sacrificed so much to preserve, survives only as an academic file number, proof that even the most meticulous documentation of evil can fade into obscurity when the world no longer cares to listen. Time, which erases most sins and softens the edges of cruelty, did little to change the moral unease surrounding Moss Creek. By the late 20th century, Eleanor Cresswell's name had become a ghost in the annals of Southern history, a whispered curiosity among historians who argued not about what she had done, but about why she had done it. To some, she was a vengeful woman consumed by bitterness, her crimes a personal vendetta disguised as a moral crusade. To others, she was a tragic figure who, trapped in a world that denied her power, turned the very tools of oppression into weapons against the oppressors. Yet for all their debates, no one could deny the magnitude of her obsession, the relentless patience of a woman who had spent 16 years crafting a legacy meant to dismantle the moral foundations of the society that destroyed her. The deeper scholars delved into her coded writings, the more they realized how deliberate every act had been. The drawings of faces, the measurements of skulls and limbs, the careful cross-referencing of family features, all pointed to an intellect both brilliant and deranged. Eleanor had understood the language of evidence long before science had given it a name. She had built her own proto-anthropology of revenge, anticipating the methods of criminologists and genealogists by nearly a century, yet bending them to a singular and terrible purpose. Her archive was not a confession but an indictment, written in the cold precision of a scientist recording the extinction of a species. As her work gained sporadic attention in academic circles, the question that came to define Eleanor's legacy was one no historian could answer cleanly. Could her actions ever be justified by her intentions? She had uncovered hypocrisy, yes, but at the cost of human life. She had exposed the moral rot of slavery, but by murdering those already victimized by it. Even her son Henry's complicity complicated the narrative further. He had been born from the union that set her on her path, the living embodiment of the injustice she sought to avenge. Yet in helping her, he had perpetuated the very cruelty she despised. Some researchers speculated that Henry's disappearance in 1864 had not been an accident at all, but a flight from unbearable guilt. A final act of defiance against the woman who had taught him that righteousness could excuse anything. Others suggested that he had died continuing her mission elsewhere, that the fragments of similar coded notes found decades later in Philadelphia archives were his work. No one could say for certain. What remained clear was that Eleanor's story refused to fit neatly into the moral categories history preferred. She was both oppressor and avenger, victim and executioner, prophet and lunatic. In classrooms and small conferences, her case was dissected as a study in ethical paradox. Professors quoted her chilling words, "Living men can lie, dead men cannot," as an example of how easily conviction can masquerade as justice. Feminist scholars reclaimed her as a symbol of rebellion, arguing that in a world where women had no lawful power, violence became the only language the system understood. Critics pushed back, warning that to romanticize her was to ignore the humanity of those she killed. Men whose only crime had been to carry the features of their white fathers. The debates went in circles, each interpretation collapsing under the weight of the next, until Eleanor's legacy became what she had always been in life, an unresolved question. Even the archives holding her ledgers seemed to participate in the silence. The iron box, preserved under glass, drew few visitors. Those who did see it described an eerie feeling, as if the air around it carried a memory of guilt. The pages, though digitized and transcribed, lost their menace on computer screens, the terror of their creation flattened into text and metadata. Meanwhile, the land where Moss Creek once stood continued to evolve without conscience. Asphalt spread where crops had grown. The shopping center parking lot gleamed beneath fluorescent lights. Few who parked their cars there knew that beneath the concrete lay bones still unclaimed, their names lost to history, their identities erased by both their murderer and the progress that followed. Only local folklore kept the ghost of Moss Creek alive. Older residents spoke of strange happenings during the construction, machines that stalled for no reason, workers who claimed to hear voices when digging too deep, a night watchman who quit after seeing a woman in gray walking across the lot and vanishing before his eyes. Most dismissed these stories as superstition, but for some, the unease lingered. The place had been built on secrets, and secrets have a way of shaping the air long after truth has been buried. Over time, Eleanor Cresswell's story found its way into documentaries, novels, and podcasts that thrived on the macabre. Each retelling altered her slightly. Some painted her as a tragic anti-heroine, others as a demon cloaked in intellect. Audiences debated her motives, fascinated by the thin line between righteousness and insanity. Yet beneath every retelling lay the same haunting truth: the world had not changed as much as it liked to think. Systems still justified cruelty in the name of order, and vengeance still masqueraded as justice. Eleanor's ledger, though born in the 19th century, felt disturbingly modern, a record of how human beings rationalize atrocity when convinced their suffering grants them moral license. The irony was cruel and perfect. Eleanor had wanted her evidence to make the world confront its sins. Instead, it became a mirror reflecting its continuity. Her story endured not as a revelation but as a warning whispered through time, reminding anyone who dared to listen that the pursuit of truth without mercy leads only to another kind of darkness, one that feels righteous even as it devours the soul. The rediscovery of Eleanor Cresswell's story in the late 20th century reignited old debates, but also illuminated something deeper about how history itself decides which truths are worth remembering. Scholars who studied her ledgers found themselves unsettled not only by the atrocities she committed, but by the precision with which she recorded them, as if she believed that accuracy could redeem cruelty. Her handwriting, neat and almost serene, betrayed no emotion, no doubt, only the calm conviction of a woman who thought she was preserving justice for a future that would understand her. But when that future finally arrived, it could not decide whether to condemn her or pity her. Academics analyzed her like a case study in moral extremity, a cautionary tale of intellect corrupted by obsession. Philosophers wrote essays on the ethics of vengeance, citing her as an example of how a righteous purpose, once detached from compassion, collapses into monstrosity. Yet the public treated her story as entertainment, another dark curiosity from a brutal past. Documentaries narrated her crimes in somber tones, while online articles paired her face reconstructed from portraits and descriptions, with sensational headlines calling her the Widow of Moss Creek, or the first serial avenger of the South. Each retelling stripped away a layer of complexity until what remained was legend, a ghostly figure in a gray dress haunting the ruins of her plantation, a symbol of both justice and damnation, her truth flattened into spectacle. In Georgia, the land that once hid her victims thrived under new ownership, its surface transformed but its history unresolved. The shopping center built over Moss Creek continued to expand, its parking lot stretching across the very ground where 16 men had been buried. The developers had placed a modest plaque near the entrance, a single metal rectangle that mentioned only the name Moss Creek Plantation, and its operation under Eleanor Cresswell in the mid-1800s. No mention of the graves, the ledgers, or the blood-soaked soil beneath. For most visitors, it was an irrelevant footnote, an antique detail with no bearing on the coffee shops and department stores that now occupied the land. Yet a few residents still spoke of strange sensations in the area, of the air growing heavy in the late hours, of sudden chills without wind, of dreams filled with whispers and indistinct faces. The rational dismissed it as imagination, but those who knew the story wondered if the dead had found peace or merely silence. After all, Eleanor's crimes had been exposed too late for justice and too soon for redemption. Her victims had become proof rather than people, their bodies used to build an argument no one ever heard. Among the historians who revisited her case, one name stood out: Dr. Benjamin Harker, an anthropologist from Emory University, who spent much of the 1980s studying the genetic lineages of Georgia's old families. His research inadvertently intersected with Eleanor's ledgers, which contained the same family names his DNA analyses traced. Harker's findings confirmed, scientifically and irrefutably, what Eleanor had once proven through observation. The boundaries between races in the antebellum South had been porous, violated, and denied. Bloodlines were tangled, mixed by the very men who had built laws to separate them. In a cruel irony, Eleanor's evidence, gathered through murder and secrecy, was now being validated through technology she could never have imagined. But even this new revelation failed to stir outrage. Society had moved on, preferring its sanitized myths to uncomfortable truths. For all her horrors, Eleanor had achieved the one thing she never wanted: to be right but irrelevant. Dr. Harker later wrote in his journal that studying her work felt like conversing with a ghost. She was not insane, he noted. She was deliberate. Her madness was logic without empathy. Those words captured the essence of what made Eleanor so disturbing. She had been brilliant enough to see the hypocrisy of her world, but too damaged to challenge it without becoming part of its cruelty. She had weaponized truth in the same way her enemies had weaponized power. Even her choice of victims, young men whose faces reflected the shameful secrets of their masters, symbolized her attempt to use the system's own blood against it. Yet in doing so, she replicated its violence, trapping herself in the same cycle she had sworn to destroy. This realization haunted Harker, as it had haunted others before him, because it spoke not just of Eleanor but of humanity itself, our tendency to repeat the sins we fight against, to mirror our oppressors in the name of righteousness. As decades passed, the fascination with Moss Creek ebbed and flowed. Writers romanticized Eleanor as a tragic heroine, filmmakers turned her story into gothic drama, and scholars, weary of debating her morality, shifted focus to her psychology. What kind of grief could harden a woman into believing that murder could be justice? Some pointed to the loss of her lover, sold into death for daring to exist between two worlds. Others to the suffocating gender roles that denied her power except through deceit and violence. But no interpretation could contain her entirely. She remained an enigma, a woman who had seen the truth of her world too clearly and chosen the darkest possible path to confront it. In this way, Eleanor became a mirror for every age that rediscovered her. Each generation saw its own reflection in her story, the dangers of fanaticism, the seduction of moral certainty, the thin line between justice and vengeance. Today, few people remember the name Eleanor Cresswell outside of academic footnotes or the occasional online article shared for its shocking value. The field where she buried her victims is still paved, the markers still vague, and the archives still quiet. Yet in that silence lies the final irony of her life's work. She had devoted everything, her sanity, her soul, her humanity, to ensuring that truth could never again be buried. But truth, like the bodies she hid, eventually disappeared beneath the weight of indifference. The world did not reject her findings, it simply stopped caring, and so Moss Creek, the place she once called her weapon, became her grave as well, a monument not to justice or evil, but to futility. The whispers that linger there are not of vengeance or revelation, but of forgotten things calling out to be remembered, asking what good truth can do if it arrives too late for anyone to listen. In the early years of the 21st century, when the world had grown accustomed to discovering its past through glowing screens and digital archives, Eleanor Cresswell's name surfaced once more, not in history books or universities, but on the internet. A true crime blogger stumbled across her story in an obscure academic paper and wrote an article titled "The Widow Who Buried the Truth." Within weeks, the story went viral, comment sections filled with speculation and moral debate. Amateur historians dissected the details of her crimes, while conspiracy theorists claimed the state of Georgia had covered up the full extent of her killings. Podcasts devoted entire episodes to her, weaving dramatized versions of her life with eerie sound effects and whispered narration. For a brief moment, the world seemed to rediscover the chilling fascination that had surrounded Moss Creek a century earlier. Yet this time, the conversation was different. Listeners didn't see Eleanor as a monster or a martyr. They saw her as content. She became part of a digital spectacle. Her horrors turned into entertainment consumed by millions who scrolled past her story between celebrity gossip and political scandals. The crimes that had once shaken the conscience of scholars were now flattened into an algorithmic narrative, something to click, to share, to forget. For the first time in history, Eleanor Cresswell achieved what she had always wanted. Her truth was everywhere. Her ledgers were scanned, transcribed, and posted online. Her letters became memes. Her quotes, stripped of context, were printed on T-shirts sold through novelty websites. The words she had written in candlelight with shaking hands, words meant to expose the corruption of her world, were now trivialized by the casual indifference of digital culture. The irony was brutal. The woman who had killed to make the world face its sins was finally heard, but by an audience that no longer believed in sin at all. Most readers reacted not with outrage, but with fascination, praising her as the first female serial killer with a cause, or analyzing her as if she were a fictional character instead of a human being who had once existed. Historians tried to intervene, reminding the public that beneath every line of Eleanor's handwriting lay the bones of real people. But the internet thrived on spectacle, not solemnity. and so she became what all complicated figures eventually become in the age of information: simplified, distorted, consumed. Still, her story carried an unsettling resonance in the new century. The questions she had raised about power, truth, and vengeance no longer belonged to the past. Activists cited her as a symbol of how systems protect their own lies, while moral critics used her as a warning of what happens when justice turns violent. The parallels were impossible to ignore. In a world still divided by race, class, and inherited privilege, Eleanor's actions seemed both distant and eerily familiar. She had lived in a time when truth required blood to be believed. Now the world lived in an age where truth could be buried under noise. Her life became a metaphor for the shifting ways society engages with evil, how outrage turns to fascination, and fascination to forgetfulness. And in that cycle, Eleanor's presence lingered like a ghost in the machine, whispering through pixels and data streams, reminding humanity that forgetting is its most refined cruelty. In 2012, a filmmaker from Savannah named Amelia Roth began working on a documentary titled Moss Creek, The Widow's Ledger. She visited the Georgia Historical Society archives, interviewed historians, and spent nights reading Eleanor's journals until she claimed to dream of the woman herself. The film premiered quietly at a regional festival, but soon gained attention for its haunting portrayal of Eleanor's descent into madness. Roth's decision to narrate the film using Eleanor's own writings blurred the line between empathy and horror, forcing audiences to confront the contradiction of a woman who sought justice through slaughter. Critics praised it for its complexity, and for a time, Eleanor's name returned to serious discussion. But even then, the focus shifted from her victims to her psychology, from the dead to the woman who had made them so. Once again, truth bowed to curiosity. During the film's production, Roth visited the site of Moss Creek, now fully commercialized, and arranged permission to film beneath the parking lot where the graves were once found. Using ground-penetrating radar, her team detected faint disturbances in the soil, evidence of human remains still untouched beneath the layers of concrete. The discovery briefly made headlines, prompting discussions about whether the land should be excavated and memorialized. Yet no action followed. Legal complications, property disputes, and the apathy of local officials buried the effort before it began. The shopping center remained open, business continued, and the whispers of the dead stayed trapped under asphalt. For all the technology and progress of the modern world, nothing had changed. The same silence that had protected Eleanor's secrets in life continued to protect her sins in death. In an interview years later, Roth reflected on the film and her obsession with its subject. "I started this to tell the story of a monster," she said, "but the more I read, the more I saw a reflection of us. Eleanor's sin wasn't just murder. It was believing that truth can justify anything. We still do that every day, just in quieter ways." Her words echoed what historians had always suspected. Eleanor's legacy endured not because of what she revealed about the past, but because she revealed something timeless about human nature. Every age finds its own way to commit the same crime, to destroy in the name of justice, to forget in the name of peace. And so Eleanor Cresswell, the widow of Moss Creek, lives on not as a ghost or legend, but as a question. Today, standing in the parking lot where the old plantation once breathed, one might feel nothing at all, just the hum of cars, the glow of neon, the rhythm of a world that has forgotten. But beneath the concrete, in the soil that once soaked up the blood of truth and vengeance, the earth still remembers. The air still carries the memory of what it witnessed. And if one stands quietly enough, in the hour between night and dawn, they might imagine hearing the faint rustle of paper beneath their feet, the turning of pages from a ledger long closed, as if history itself were restless, waiting for someone, anyone, to finally read it and understand. The years slipped quietly onward, and Moss Creek, once a name that carried both horror and fascination, faded again into silence, The shopping center expanded twice more, its polished storefronts and bright signs leaving no trace of the earth that had once been stained with blood. Time smoothed everything. The past was paved over, both literally and in memory, as the story of Eleanor Cresswell drifted to the fringes of history once more. Her name lingered faintly in archives and on a few university shelves, in films and essays, but the world had moved on, as it always does. Yet sometimes, history waits for the right moment to return. In 2021, a storm swept through the region, its rain relentless and its wind fierce. Trees fell, the parking lot cracked in several places, and when workers came to repair the damage, one of them uncovered a patch of soil where the asphalt had buckled. Beneath it, they found bones, weathered, fragile, and unmistakably human. The police arrived, the news followed, and suddenly Moss Creek was alive again. Forensic teams excavated cautiously, revealing what the radar had only hinted at years before. The remains of 13 people, aligned irregularly in the same rocky patch where Eleanor's victims had been buried more than a century and a half earlier. The discovery reignited public obsession. News channels framed it as a historical crime scene, blending archaeology with spectacle. Experts appeared on talk shows debating whether the site should be preserved as a memorial or left undisturbed. The university that once ignored Eleanor's ledgers now dispatched historians and anthropologists to examine the remains. DNA tests, applied with modern precision, confirmed what her meticulous notes had always claimed. The bones bore genetic ties to several prominent Southern families still living in Georgia. The revelation caused a quiet scandal among the wealthy descendants who had long taken pride in their unbroken lineage. Some denied the findings, others dismissed them as coincidence, but the data was clear. Eleanor's truth, buried for generations, had surfaced once again. Yet even in vindication, she remained a paradox. For every voice that called her a prophet ahead of her time, another condemned her as a murderer who desecrated both the living and the dead. Among those who worked on the excavation was a young historian named Sarah Thorne, a distant relative of William Thorne, the cotton broker whose death had long been the turning point in Eleanor's story. Sarah had grown up hearing fragments of family lore about the man who disappeared on business in 1857, never knowing the truth behind his murder until she encountered Eleanor's journals during her research. She approached the dig site with quiet reverence, driven not by vengeance but by understanding. One evening, while reviewing the site's findings, she discovered something overlooked in the initial sorting: a small iron pendant, its surface engraved with the initials EC, and the faint outline of a crescent moon. The artifact had likely belonged to Eleanor herself, lost or discarded during her final years. Holding it in her palm, Sarah felt an inexplicable pull, a sense of both sorrow and awe. It was as if the past had reached forward not to frighten her, but to remind her that history never truly disappears. It merely waits beneath the surface, patient and alive. The state eventually declared the site a historical landmark. The shopping center relocated, and the land was transformed into a memorial garden named the Field of Voices. Beneath a canopy of oak trees, a stone walkway wound through the grass toward a single marble plaque bearing no names, only an inscription carved in simple letters: "Truth, once buried, still speaks." Visitors came in small numbers, some out of curiosity, others out of reverence. The air around the place felt different, still, heavy, as if aware of what it guarded. At sunset, the wind that swept across the garden seemed to carry whispers from another time. Some claimed to hear voices, low and rhythmic, speaking words they couldn't understand. Others felt nothing at all, only a faint chill when standing too close to the old soil. Whatever one believed, the silence of Moss Creek had finally been broken, not by vengeance nor by violence, but by remembrance. For Sarah Thorne, the experience reshaped her understanding of history. She wrote her own book, not about murder or scandal, but about how truth changes meaning depending on when it's found. Eleanor wanted justice, she wrote, but what she created was memory, and memory, is the only kind of justice time allows. Her words captured what Moss Creek had come to represent: the futility of vengeance, the persistence of truth, and the fragile balance between revelation and ruin. As night falls over the memorial now, the field glows faintly under the light of lanterns placed along the path. The hum of the modern world fades at its edges, leaving only the sound of wind moving through the trees. Beneath that soil, where bones and roots intertwine, the story of Eleanor Cresswell rests at last, not absolved, not forgiven, but remembered. And in that remembrance lies a kind of peace she never found in life. The land, once cursed by silence, now breathes again, its truth no longer buried in darkness, but carried softly through the air. An echo that says the dead do not ask for revenge, only to be heard.